Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We continue our discussion here of life in the colonies, and beginning with this lecture and continuing over the next several lectures, we're going to address one of the most important issues in all of American history and one of the most important questions, and that relates to the question of the origins of racism, which are rooted, of course, in the institution of African slavery. So starting with this lecture, we're going to talk about the origins of African slavery, and then we'll spend several lectures after this one talking about the institution of slavery itself in the colonies. I first just want to point out to those of you who might be interested in reading more on this incredibly important question, these are some of the most prominent scholars and some of the sources that the information I'll be sharing in the next few lectures are drawn from. And these include Winthrop Jordan, White Over Black, Peter Wood, Black Majority, and Ed Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom. There are, of course, many other books that you can refer to on this, but these are some of the most prominent. So one of the ways that scholars have kind of wrestled with these questions about racism and slavery in this period is almost unpacking it in a chicken or the egg kind of way. So which came first, slavery or racism? Can we have slavery without racism, or can we have racism without slavery, and so on? So we're going to talk a little bit about this issue over the next few slides in this lecture, and just thinking about kind of the origins of slavery, but also the origins of white racism. So one way to think about this is to try to look back and think about English attitudes towards Africans before slavery, so prior to the 17th century. And so the scholars I've referenced and others have come to see that the English in that era regarded Africans as different, but there wasn't necessarily the assumption that they should be enslaved. So, if we think about what were some of the ways that Africans were different from English, well, obviously there is skin color, but there's also religion, different kinds of civilization, what kind of clothing did they wear, housing, farming, warfare, language, different kinds of government, what were their morals, what were their manners, and so on. So there are all kinds of differences between these two civilizations that may or may not be related to race. However, it's clear that skin color is an important consideration, and perhaps the most important, because color means something. Color signifies something symbolically. If you just think about the associations of white versus black, associations come to mind like purity versus filth, virginity versus sin, virtue versus baseness, beauty versus ugliness, good versus evil, and so on. There's another association that the English had that doesn't necessarily imply or mandate that Africans would be subjected to slavery, but it does begin to shed light on perhaps why the English viewed this as acceptable in the long run. And that is that Africans were associated with beastliness. There were comparisons in English culture of that day between Africans and apes, or Africans and beasts. So if we think about a source like Shakespeare's play Othello, you have the character of, and Othello was of African origin. You have the character of Iago, who says things like, "I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leaped into my seat," and "a black ram is tupping your white ewe." So there are associations between Africans and kind of beastly or primitive kind of acts. We get a sense of that from this painting, which derives from that era, the 1500s, if not earlier. And it shows the explorer Marco Polo relating with some Africans. So some of the things you might notice in this picture, not only is his skin white, but all of his clothing is white. He stands out in this picture as a pristine white figure. He's also, of course, larger than all of the Africans, and that is surely a symbolic depiction. He wasn't necessarily larger than Africans, but in this painting he is. The Africans are drawn in such a way that you can't discern their faces. There's something sort of primitive about them. In many cases, they are sort of crouching or low, whereas Marco Polo is standing more upright, and so on. So there are all these kind of symbolic associations drawn between the English and Africans. So we see by the 1500s there are already these kind of associations of difference between Africans and English, black and white, but they don't necessarily lead us to slavery. But there are other factors as well. One of them looks to the Bible as the origin of the different races. And in this case, the origin story of the African race lies in the story of Noah and what is known as the curse of Ham. And I'll refer actually to a source of this era to kind of describe their version of this story. So this is from George Best, who was an English explorer, writing in about 1577. And so he wrote that while they were in the ark, Noah commanded his sons and their wives to behold God with reverence and fear, and that while they remained in the ark, they should use continency, and abstain from carnal copulation with their wives. Which good instructions and exhortations notwithstanding, his wicked son Ham disobeyed, and being persuaded that the first child born after the flood should inherit all the dominions of the earth, he used company with his wife, and craftily went about thereby to disinherit the offspring of his other two brethren. To punish this wicked and detestable fact, God willed that a son should be born, whose name was Chus, who not only itself, but all his posterity after him, should be so black and loathsome, that it might remain a spectacle of disobedience to all the world. And of this black and cursed Chus came all these black Moors which are in Africa. Now there are a number of versions of this story. Some say that Ham looked on Noah naked and was cursed for that. In any case, the various origin stories associated with Africans all come from this idea that it was a sinful, cursed race. Now let's think about the other side of this equation, and what did the English know about slavery before they embarked on participating in that practice themselves? Well, for the English, freedom was a key concept. The English in this period didn't enslave their own kind, but they knew of slavery from some other sources. So in the various religious wars they had waged over time, against the Turks, against the Muslims and the Moors, sometimes the English themselves were captured and enslaved. So they understood military capture can lead to slavery. They also knew that the Portuguese and the Spanish in the New World were enslaving Africans. And so perhaps an equation begins to develop from that knowledge that African equals slave. And then further, in the minds of the English, slavery was a practice that removed one's humanity. You were treating someone like a beast or an animal if you were enslaving them. And that comes back to our reference on the previous slide, to the idea that Africans in the minds of the English were already associated with beastliness in some ways. So those previous slides give us some indication why the English may have been drawn to African slavery as a practice. So let's talk about just some overall important points to keep in mind as we begin discussing slavery more specifically. So first of all, bear in mind that 6 out of 7 immigrants who came to the Americas before the American Revolution were African slaves. And I would also point out that the majority of those did not come to the North American colonies, which we're going to talk about more in just a moment. Approximately 12 million Africans reached the Americas during this era. And that includes North and South America and the Caribbean, and I'm going to show you a chart in just a moment the great majority of those are not coming to the British North American colonies. Untold millions more died in the process of capture and shipment, so we can never really know the full number of Africans who were ensnared in this process. We're also going to talk a little bit about how African slavery was not the only type or the first type of labor used in the colonies. I've already mentioned to you in some previous lectures how Native Americans were sometimes used as slaves, and we're going to talk about that again a little bit later. But there are other options for labor, and yet we find the English turn increasingly to African slavery. We'll need to figure out why that is. African slavery could be very different depending on the time and the place, and we're going to discuss some examples of that. Depending on the region and depending on the time period, the methods of treatment of slaves could be very different. African slavery also evolves over time and through several stages, which we're going to be discussing as well. It's not the same in the 1600s as it is in the early 1800s, for instance. And finally, it's important to bear in mind that not all Africans were the same, and not all slaves that are brought out of Africa are the same. And this was a gross misunderstanding in the colonies themselves when Africans who might have been captured from very different parts of Africa would not have known each other at all, probably didn't speak the same language. Maybe their tribes were even at war with each other, and yet they would all be thrown in together with kind of the expectations that they would all act the same under those conditions. So let me just point out a couple of things. This is a chart demonstrating where the slaves came from and in what numbers. And there's a lot to think about here, and you might just pause this slide and look at it a little bit longer. But one thing to note, the British North American colonies and the future United States are this number here. So only about 5% of all the African slaves imported to the New World came to those British colonies. The much larger numbers went to Brazil, went to the Caribbean, and the different nations within the Caribbean. So we're going to be focusing just on this 5%, but it's important to bear in mind it's a relatively small percentage of the overall numbers who are coming. And this map illustrates the other point that I mentioned, that in fact the Africans who are enslaved are coming from a vast portion of the continent, and in some cases from even further inland than what you see on this particular map. But, you know, folks who came from up here would have been very different from folks who were coming from these other regions. This also gives you some indication of the numbers and where they were being shipped. The thickness of these arrows indicates that. So Brazil is one of the main targets, and then the great majority going to the Caribbean. And only this slim arrow, that's that 5% who are coming to the British North American colonies. So over the next several lectures, we're going to be talking more about the practice of slavery and a lot of its different characteristics in the British colonies.